The part I remember most clearly isn't the moment she handed me the check. It's the moment my daughter looked up at me from the kitchen table, crayon still in her hand, and said, "Daddy, are you famous now?" I told her no. I told her I was just a guy who paid attention. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Frank Deller. I'm a plumber. Have been for going on 18 years, out of a small shop I run with one part-time helper out of Barrie, Ontario. Nothing fancy. A white van with a magnetic sign on the side, a website my brother-in-law built in 2019 that I still haven't updated, and more work than I can handle in the summer and just enough to survive in January. I've got a daughter named Rosalind. Roz, we call her, who is 7 years old and thinks duct tape can fix anything, which she gets from me. Her mother left when Roz was 3. That's a longer story and not the one I'm telling today. I'm telling you about the day I drove out to a property on Kempenfelt Bay and ended up in the middle of something I still don't fully understand. It started with a call I almost didn't take. It was a Tuesday in late October. I had 2 jobs already booked and a third that kept moving. A guy in Innisfil who needed a pressure valve replaced but couldn't seem to commit to a time. My phone rang at 7:40 in the morning, number I didn't recognize, area code 416, Toronto. I picked up because I thought it might be a parts supplier I'd been waiting on. It wasn't. The woman on the line had the kind of voice that's used to being listened to. Not rude, not loud, just certain. She said her name was Margaret Bonsu, that she'd gotten my number from a contractor named Phil Hartwick, and that she had a situation at her property on the bay that needed to be looked at immediately. She said the word immediately the way some people say, please, like it was a courtesy they were extending, not a request they were making. I told her I had 2 jobs already on the books. She said she understood, and then she said a number. I told her I'd be there by 9. I'm not proud of that, but I've got a kid and a mortgage and a van that needs new rear tires before the snow comes, so let's just move on. The property wasn't what I expected. I'd driven past that stretch of Kempenfelt Bay 100 times and always assumed the big lots were owned by old Barrie money, retired insurance guys, that kind of thing. But the gate I pulled up to was newer than anything on the road. Stone pillars, intercom, camera mounted up top. I gave my name, and the gate swung open. The house was, look, I've been inside a lot of houses. Finished basements and new additions and places where the renovation budget was clearly whatever was left over after somebody bought a boat. I thought I had a decent idea of what nice looked like in this part of Ontario. I didn't. This was something else. 4,000 square feet at minimum. All glass and timber and careful landscaping that still looked intentional even with half the leaves off the trees. A dock that ran 40 feet out into the water. 2 vehicles in the driveway, a black Range Rover and something low and gray that I later found out was a McLaren. A man in a fleece vest opened the door before I got to it. He introduced himself as Douglas and said he was Miss Bonsu's property manager. He walked me through a mudroom the size of my kitchen, down a hallway with heated tile floors, and into a utility room off the back of the house where the mechanical systems lived. He pointed at the radiant heating manifold and left without saying much else. I stood there for a minute and looked at it. The system was high-end, German-made, the kind of thing that gets installed when someone isn't watching the budget, and it had been installed well. But something wasn't right. The boiler was cycling on and off faster than it should have been, and 2 of the zones weren't reaching temperature, even though the thermostats were calling for heat. I could hear it struggling. I'd actually seen this before, about 4 years earlier, in a chalet up near Collingwood. Not the same brand, but the same symptom. Short cycling like that, with uneven zone distribution, usually points to a few things. I started checking them in order. The expansion tank first. It had lost its precharge. The bladder was shot, so the system pressure was spiking every time the boiler fired, triggering the pressure relief, which was why it kept shutting off. Classic failure. Slow, invisible, and almost always misdiagnosed, because most people go straight to the boiler itself. I found the other problem about 20 minutes later. One of the zone valves, the one serving the main floor, had a faulty actuator. The motor was running, but the valve wasn't opening all the way. So the boiler was working against a partially closed loop, building pressure, tripping out, over and over. 2 parts. That was it. An expansion tank and a zone valve actuator. I went back out to the hallway and asked Douglas if Ms. Bonsu was available. He looked at me the way people look at tradespeople when they're not sure if they should escalate, like he was calculating something. Then he went upstairs. She came down about 5 minutes later. Margaret Osebansu was probably 50, give or take a few years. She was wearing a dark turtleneck and had her hair pulled back, and she moved through her own house the way people move through airports, efficiently, like she already knew where everything was and had somewhere else to be. She shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and said, "What is it?" I told her. She listened without interrupting, which I always respect. Then she asked how long it would take to fix. I said I'd need to source the parts, the expansion tank I could get from a supply house in Barrie that day. But the zone valve actuator was a specific model and I'd need to check stock. Probably same day or next morning, she said. The company that installed this system told me last week it was a problem with the boiler itself. They quoted me $42,000 to replace the boiler and rebalance the system. I didn't say anything for a second. She said, "Is that what it is?" I said no. I said the boiler was fine. I said the whole problem was a failed expansion tank and one faulty actuator, and that the parts together would run somewhere around $380, plus my labor. She looked at me for a long moment, not like she didn't believe me, more like she was deciding something. Then she said, "The company that quoted me $42,000, they've done work here before. They installed this system 3 years ago. My property manager trusts them." I said I understood that. She said, "And you're telling me it's $380 in parts." I said that's what I was telling her. She said, "If you're right, I'll pay you double your rate for the job. If you're wrong, if I have you replace these parts and the system still doesn't work, I want you to cover the cost of bringing the other company back in." Now, I want to be clear about what she was proposing. She was asking me to bet my liability on a diagnosis I'd made in 40 minutes in a stranger's utility room. If I was wrong, I was looking at covering a service call from a company that would probably charge $1,000 just to show up. Plus, whatever they said was wrong after that. It wasn't a bet I'd normally take. But I wasn't wrong. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a guess and a read. And what I had in that utility room was a read. I'd seen it before. I'd felt it. The rhythm of the boiler, the way the pressure gauge moved, the resistance in the loop. You develop a sense for it after enough years, and mine was telling me clearly what the problem was. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay?" I said, "Yes. Deal." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. I drove to the supply house on Essa Road, got the expansion tank. The actuator I tracked down at a shop out on Dunlop that I dealt with a few times. Right model. Last one in stock. I was back at the property by 1:30. It took me 2.5 hours to do the work. I drained the system, replaced the expansion tank, pre-charged it to the right pressure, swapped out the actuator on the zone valve, refilled and bled the loops, and fired everything back up. Douglas stood in the doorway for part of it, watching without saying anything. I didn't mind. Some people need to see the work to trust the result. When the system came back online, it ran clean. No short cycling. The zones came up to temperature in the right sequence. The pressure held steady. I stood there for about 15 minutes just watching it, because that's what you do. You make sure it's not just starting well, you make sure it's running right. Then I went to find Douglas. He took me upstairs to a sitting room off the main hall where Margaret was working at a desk. She had a laptop open and reading glasses on, and she looked up when I came in. I said it was done. She said, "It's running?" I said yes. All zones. No more short cycling. She'd want to monitor it over the next 24 hours to confirm everything balanced out, but I didn't expect any more problems. She took off her glasses and set them on the desk. She said, "Walk me through it again. What was actually wrong?" So I did. I explained the expansion tank, how the bladder fails over time, how it causes pressure spikes, how the boiler's safety system reads those spikes and shuts down to protect itself. I explained the zone valve actuator, how a partial failure there creates a restricted loop, which compounds the pressure problem and makes everything worse. I told her that a competent technician with experience on this type of system should have found both of these things in the first visit. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The company that installed this is the same company that quoted me the boiler replacement. I've given them close to $90,000 in work over the past 4 years, between this property and 2 others. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She said, "They told me the expansion tank was fine. They said they checked it." I said I didn't know what they'd checked, but the one I pulled out had been failing for a while. The pressure reading on it was wrong. There was no way to look at it and think it was fine. She picked up her pen and turned it over in her hand a few times. Then she said, "What do I owe you?" I gave her the number. Parts plus labor at double rate, the way she'd proposed. It came to just under $1,400. She wrote the check without blinking. Then she wrote a second one. I looked at it. She said, "That's for the diagnostic, the actual work of finding what was wrong. That's separate from the repair." I said that wasn't part of our agreement. She said, "I'm amending the agreement." The second check was for $3,000. I stood there holding both of them, and I had this strange feeling, not quite embarrassment, not quite pride, something in between. Like when someone thanks you in a way that's bigger than you expected, and you don't know what to do with your hands. I said I appreciated it, but I wasn't sure I'd earned the extra. She said, "You found a problem that 3 other people missed, one of whom I was about to pay $42,000 to fix incorrectly. I think you've earned it." I didn't argue further. I'm not an idiot. But then she said something else. She said, "I'd like to put you on a service contract for all 3 of my properties. Quarterly inspections, priority call. I'll have my assistant reach out this week to discuss terms." And that's when something shifted for me. Not in a dramatic way. Quiet, like a valve that finally opens all the way. Because I knew what that meant. 3 properties like this one, quarterly visits, priority rate. That's the kind of work that changes what your year looks like. That's the difference between replacing your van tires in October and waiting until they're bald in February. I said I'd be glad to discuss it. She stood up and extended her hand, and we shook again, the way we had at the beginning, except this time it felt like something different. Less like a contractor and a client, and more like 2 people who'd established something. Douglas walked me out. I sat in my van for a minute before I started it. I thought about the company that quoted $42,000. I didn't know those guys personally. Barrie isn't that small, but it's not that big either, and I had a feeling I'd cross paths with someone eventually. I thought about what it takes to look at a system that's short-cycling and write up a full boiler replacement, whether it's incompetence or something worse. I decided I didn't want to spend too much time thinking about it. I thought about the expansion tank sitting in the back of my van, pulled from that system, pressure reading still off, 3 years old. You could test it yourself if you knew what you were looking for. I drove home. Roz was at my mother's after school that day, the way she is on Tuesdays. I picked her up at 6. She had a drawing she'd made, some kind of house with a very large sun and 2 figures in front of it. She'd labeled them. The tall one said Dad, and the small one said Me. She said, "That's our new house." I said, "We had a perfectly good house," she said, "but what if we got a bigger one?" I said, "Maybe someday." She seemed satisfied with that and went to put her boots away, which she never does without being asked, so I think she was in a good mood. I put the drawing on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a moose that we got at a rest stop on the 400, somewhere north of Parry Sound. It's been up there since the summer, and the magnet's not quite strong enough for it, so it lists a little to the left. I keep meaning to swap the magnet out, and I keep not doing it. I stood at the fridge for a minute looking at that drawing. There's this thing that happens sometimes in this work, not often, but sometimes, where you solve something that other people couldn't, and for a moment you feel it. The particular satisfaction of understanding a system well enough to hear what it's trying to tell you. Most of the time, nobody sees it. You fix the thing, you leave, the client goes back to their day, and that's how it's supposed to be. The work is invisible when it's done right, but every once in a while, the work is visible. Every once in a while, someone is watching closely enough to see what it actually is. I got a call 3 days later from Margaret's assistant, a young woman named Claire who was polite and organized and had already drafted contract language. The terms were more than fair. I signed and sent it back the same afternoon. I still work out of the same shop, same white van, same magnetic sign. I got the rear tires replaced in November, before the first real snow, which meant I wasn't white-knuckling it down the 400 every time it came down, and that was worth more than I can explain to anyone who hasn't driven bald tires on black ice in the dark. Roz started a new thing where she leaves drawings on my workbench in the garage. She says she's designing things I'll need to fix someday. Last week it was something she described as a water machine for the moon. I have no idea what that means, but I put it up on the fridge anyway. The moose magnet is still listing.